Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are going to unpack one of the absolute most fascinating drivers of human behavior. Have you ever actually stopped to wonder exactly how and why we choose to consume the things we do? You know, it's not just random chance. There is a deeply structured, kind of brilliant economic logic behind our everyday decisions, and it all boils down to a concept called utility analysis. So let's dive into the economics of satisfaction.
Okay, to get us started, I want you to picture this scenario. Why is a single glass of water considered absolutely priceless if you're wandering lost in a scorching desert, but that exact same glass of water is practically worthless if you're already drowning in a lake? I mean, the water itself hasn't changed at all. The chemical composition is completely identical. What has drastically changed is the human context. This perfectly highlights the subjective and highly relative nature of human satisfaction, which really is the very foundation of what economists call utility.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll be decoding utility. Second, we'll look at its features and types. Third, we're going to compare total versus marginal utility. Fourth, we'll tackle the law of DMU. And finally, we'll wrap up with the exceptions to the rule.
All right, kicking things off with part one, decoding utility. What exactly is it?
In economics, utility has a very specific definition. It is simply the capacity of a commodity to satisfy human wants. Or if you want to put it even more simply, it's a thing's want-satisfying power. Now, a really interesting caveat here is that utility is completely subjective. It depends entirely on what a person desires in a given moment, not on the objective usefulness of the item. Take a stethoscope, for example. That has massive utility to a doctor, but absolutely zero utility to someone who isn't in medicine. It's all about the person. Economics actually doesn't judge the want at all. It just recognizes the capacity to satisfy it.
Moving right along to Section 2, Features and Types. Because utility is definitely not just an abstract idea. We see it in practice every day.
Let's look at a few common types, starting with form utility. This is basically magic. It brilliantly illustrates how value is literally created just by changing the shape or structure of a material. Think about a raw log of wood sitting in a forest. It has some utility, sure, but when a skilled carpenter takes that wood and crafts it into a beautifully structured dining table or a comfortable chair, its want-satisfying power absolutely skyrockets. The commodity has gained form utility.
Next up, we've got place utility. This happens when the utility of a commodity increases just because its location changes. Think about transportation, moving a huge shipment of mangoes from an orchard where they're abundant to a bustling urban market where people are craving them creates immense place utility. Another great example, warm woolen clothes. They hold way more utility in cold climates than they do in a tropical environment. Simply moving the goods creates the value.
And then there's knowledge utility, which is honestly super relevant today. This happens when a consumer actually acquires knowledge about a product which unlocks its value. Like if you hand a highly advanced smartphone to someone who has literally never used technology before, its utility is quite low to them. But as they learn about its functions, how to make calls, browse the web, or take photos, the want-satisfying power of that device drastically increases for that user.
Okay, part 3, total versus marginal utility, measuring satisfaction.
So we've defined utility, but how do we actually measure it? To do this, I want you to imagine consuming one more of your absolute favorite food. This brings us to a really crucial distinction in economics: total utility versus marginal utility. Total utility, or TU, is the aggregate, the grand total of satisfaction you derive from all units of a commodity you've consumed. Marginal utility, or MU, on the other hand, is the additional satisfaction derived from consuming just one more unit. So the key here is focusing on that phrase, one more. If you eat 3 slices of pizza, your total utility is the satisfaction from all 3 combined. But your marginal utility? That's the specific satisfaction you got just from eating that 3rd slice.
Let's break this down with a hypothetical example. Imagine you're eating chocolate bars. For the very first bar, your total and marginal utility are identical at 10. But watch what happens when you eat a second one. Your total utility goes up to 18, but your marginal utility, the joy from that second bar alone, drops to 8. As you keep eating, notice the pattern. Total utility is increasing, but at a diminishing rate. It goes from 10 to 18 to 24. Meanwhile, marginal utility continuously drops with each successive unit, down to 10, 8, 6, 4, 2. You are getting less and less additional joy from every extra chocolate bar you eat.
Now check out what happens at Unit 6, where marginal utility hits exactly 0.
This is a critical concept known as the point of satiation. This is the absolute peak of your satisfaction. You are completely full. If you consume even one more unit after this point, you enter the zone of negative utility or disutility. A seventh chocolate bar doesn't give you joy, it actually makes you feel sick, which subtracts from your overall total utility and brings it down.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, the law of DMU, diminishing utility.
This fascinating and honestly entirely predictable human behavior brings us to the core principle of our explainer today. First proposed by Professor Gaussen, but famously detailed by Professor Alfred Marshall way back in 1890, we have the law of diminishing marginal utility. Marshall beautifully states, the additional benefit which a person derives from a given increase in his stock of a thing diminishes with every increase in the stock that he already has. In simpler terms, the more of a thing you have, the less you want to have more of it. We literally just intuitively proved this with our chocolate bar example, but Marshall gave it the academic weight of an official economic law.
But economists being economists, they had to lay down some strict ground rules, or assumptions, for this model to work perfectly. First, they assume rationality, meaning the consumer is acting normally to maximize their satisfaction. Second is cardinal measurement, the idea that we can actually attach numbers to our psychological satisfaction, just like we did with the chocolate bars. Third is homogeneity, and this is a big one. It assumes every single unit consumed is exactly identical in size, taste, and quality. Because if your second chocolate bar was vastly superior to the first, your marginal utility might actually go up. And finally, continuity. The units have to be consumed in quick succession without taking long breaks.
Finally, Section 5, exceptions to the rule, when it breaks down.
Because human nature is messy, right? What happens when we defy the model? Well, there are a few well-known exceptions to the law of diminishing marginal utility. For certain things, every additional unit actually increases marginal utility. Take hobbies, for example. If you collect rare coins, finding your 100th rare coin gives you even more thrill than your very first one. Addictions also completely defy the law, as the desire for the substance increases the more it's consumed. And the lust for power operates similarly. When a person gets a little taste of power, their desire to have more of it typically escalates, it doesn't diminish. But keep in mind, these exceptions usually violate the core assumptions we just talked about, like rationality or homogeneity.
And then we have the ultimate debate: money. Many people argue that the marginal utility of money never ever becomes zero. After all, nobody ever really says, I have too much money, the next dollar brings me absolutely no satisfaction. However, some economists challenge this. They argue the law does still apply. They point out that a single dollar holds significantly more utility, way more want-satisfying power, for a poor person struggling to buy groceries than it does for a billionaire buying a mega yacht. The utility of that extra dollar absolutely diminishes as your wealth grows.
Well, we've covered a massive amount of ground today, moving all the way from the subjective nature of human wants to the strict economic laws that attempt to map them out. So, knowing how diminishing marginal utility basically governs our satisfaction, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. Are you truly a rational consumer, perfectly maximizing your total utility? Or do you find that your wants constantly outpace the actual utility things bring you? The next time you find yourself reaching for just one more of anything, remember this explainer and ask yourself what your marginal utility really is.